Before I get to kind of the main content of the presentation, I did want to kind of introduce myself a little bit more in depth. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm pretty new here. It's only been a couple of months that I've been at Lab. I definitely want to say thanks to everybody that I've been able to meet and work with so far. Everybody's been really friendly and really welcoming. If I haven't met you yet, please feel free, reach out to me on Teams, say hello, or maybe reach out when we're all kind of back in the same office again. I wanted to mention that because I feel like I'm still very much learning how Lab49 operates and the way people approach building products. And I love building products, and I like wearing a lot of different hats while I do it. My path to get here, it's been a little circuitous. My background, I actually started off as a graphic designer, and I grew into being an engineer and eventually learned how to be a consultant and a manager. Just a couple more little things about me. I did go to school for graphic design. I started as a designer. I'm an entirely self-taught programmer. And before I worked in the finance industry, I worked a lot with creative agencies, working on stuff, ad campaigns, little one-off promotional websites and little things like that. Oh, hey, did somebody say something? Nope, I'll keep going. So the last 5 years, I've been working in the finance industry as a consultant, and that's how I ultimately ended up at Lab49. So enough about me. Back to
I think you muted yourself.
I think I got a thing that said I got muted. Not sure what happened there, but if it happens again, just let me know. I did get a little notification, but just in case I miss it or something. I'm gonna flip back and keep going. If anything weird happens, just shout out and we'll get back on track. Okay, so creating, using, and maintaining a design system. So the way that I like to define a design system is a little bit broader than other people's definitions. And usually when people say design system, they mean a component library, but I think it's quite a lot more than that. The first major part of a design system is a living style guide, something that you can see and that you can interact with. It also includes methods of collaborating between engineering, design, and product teams. It also has a way to manage code, because if you have a living style guide and if you have a component library, you're going to have a lot of code. And you also need tools beyond just the living style guide so that you can enable all of that collaboration that I mentioned. So talking about a design system itself, what can you do with it? Well, one of the first things is that you can make development easier. You can reduce the friction of working on a really complex application on your local development machine. And I'm going to talk about how having a living style guide application can be really useful as a development environment. And yes, you can also create a component library. You'll have a centralized catalog of everything that you're creating for your application. It'll be easy to explore, which is really great, but also structuring your code as a component library can encourage good design decisions and make sharing that code within your project and across other projects much easier. And then finally, you can make the collaboration that you do have better. With the Living Style Guide application and the process in place, you get to work more closely with the design and product teams. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what is a Living Style Guide. And this is really the main output of your design system. It's what you see and it's what you interact with. You can take a lot of forms, and I think that the main requirement is that a style guide be able to grow and adapt and change as your team iterates on the product that you're building. And this could be design files like Photoshop or Sketch or Figma. It could be printed out bits of paper stuck to a corkboard. But the definition that I like to use is that it's an application that team members can interact with. So this means that you can run an app on your local machine as a developer, and it also means that you can deploy it somewhere, just like the web app that you're working on, so that other members of the team who might be non-technical can view and interact with what's inside the Living Style Guide. Ultimately, this is a tool for designers and developers to collaborate with each other. As a developer, you can work on your components. You can do it inside of the Living Style Guide. You can deploy that style guide, and then designers can go and look at the work that you accomplished. They can offer feedback and guidance well before any of your UI code is in your application or even pushed into production. So I'm sure a lot of you, definitely the front end focused engineers, have heard and have probably worked with Storybook. If you haven't worked with Storybook before, I do want to clarify, if you're at Lab, there is a tool called Storybook. This is different. This is the free open source tool that you can use to create a living style guide. It's an application. You run it on your local machine, and it's completely disconnected from the main application or product that you're actually building. And inside Storybook, you could actually use it as a development environment for all of your UI components. You can build them right there, and then later you can integrate those components into the application that you're working on. And also working on components in isolation, again, means isolation from the product that you're working on. But as I had mentioned earlier, it's also isolating components from each other. I'm going to talk a lot more about this, but this is the way that you structure your code. And I'd like to kind of drive home the point a little bit further. You could imagine in an application that you're working on, there might be a complex multi-step form. And at the very end of that process, maybe there's a UI component that shows a summary and shows you an animated success message. And if you weren't using an environment like Storybook, in order to actually work on that very last part of the flow, you might have to start up the application, log into it, wait for everything to load, navigate in the app to where that form submission flow starts, fill out the form, each step, submit it, wait for the response, and then you get to that final step in the flow. But with Storybook, you can skip all of that. You get to work on just that UI component by itself. And then later, you can compose all of those individual bits of UI into more complex flows. And then when you're working in Storybook, you can stub out the data and stub out the validation and remove anything that's not strictly related to the specific UI component that you're working on. And some of the benefits of doing this are immediately obvious. It can increase the speed of development, but it also gets rid of all of that tedium that I had outlined earlier. Again, you get to focus on your UI component. And also, you can now work on UI outside of your application, which means that you can start developing your UI in isolation from other parts of your app. So if you don't have an API that's ready yet, you can still build UI components. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, and I'm definitely going to show some code that's going to help illustrate how this all really works. So the next major part of a design system is collaboration. And this is the way that all the members of the team actually works together. The specifics of how to do this is going to be different from team to team, but using a living style guide, it's going to enable people to work a lot closer together. And one of the really cool things that you can do with a living style guide is you can deploy it to somewhere that the rest of your team can actually access it. And this means that people can review the work that you're doing way faster and way earlier in the process. Imagine if you had QA engineers on your team, they can actually be included and they can look at this. You can also incorporate this into visual regression testing, and that can automate checking for regressions and errors and unexpected changes in your UI components. So now, if you do this, you can incorporate all of that design review much earlier in the development cycle. You no longer have to wait until a feature is completely done before putting it in front of a designer or a product manager. You can do it while you're working. Lots of UI components that you might build are going to have lots of different states that are going to change their appearance. And if you have really, really complex UI components, they're going to be made up of many other components. So being able to review how all of these components are interacting together and do it in a visual way in a centralized place, I believe can raise the quality of your UI. And if you're doing this with a living style guide, you get to do it sitting shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the team. I think that using a living style guide also makes collaboration just within the engineering team and within the design teams individually better. I'm sure a lot of people working on big complex applications have seen sections of the UI that are duplicated in multiple places, but maybe are just like a little bit different. And sometimes, that can get really, really hard to maintain over time if you have a lot of duplication. You can also think of your living style guide as a visual catalog of everything that you've built to date. If you're just looking at code, it's really hard to visualize what your components actually do. But using a living style guide, you can actually lay them out all in front of you. You can search through them and you can sort them. And it just makes it easier to spot things that are duplicated or are similar enough that you might want to refactor. Doing it this way also makes onboarding new members of the team a lot easier, engineers and designers both. When you come into a new team, now you can look through the living style guide and you can get familiar with what the team has already created and how all of these components look and how they work. I'm sure if there's any designers here in the audience, you probably worked with symbols in Sketch. And this is kind of a similar idea. This is like going to the symbols page and seeing everything that's been made and intended to be reused across your design file. So the third major piece of this design system is a way to manage all of this code. So some technical details here. One of the first questions that you might have is, where does all of this stuff live in your code base? If you're new to the concept of having a living style guide, it's actually quite simple and it doesn't require a lot of reorganization. You can build your stories and your components together in the same place, and you can actually think of your Storybook stories a lot like test fixtures. So you might want to actually place them right next to your tests. Also, just a point of clarification here, I'm using the word story. This is a concept that is specific to Storybook. So if you have the Storybook application running, you're going to have many stories, probably one for each component, and just wanted to point out that that term was specific to Storybook. And so this is quite simple. This is very easy to do and doesn't require a lot of reorganization, but there is another step that can become much more complex. And that might be if you wanted to move all of your UI components out into a separate library. And this is a really great thing to do if you're trying to have a cohesive look and feel across many different applications. And so if you're going to do this, you really have to think hard about how you want to structure not just your style guide, but all of the projects that are going to use your style guide. Now, I've done this before, and usually what we'll do is extract all of the generic UI components, all of the styles, documentation, tests, and the story files that I had mentioned earlier, and put them in their own code base. And then you can use something like NPM to publish that code base. Then you can pull in your style guide project as a dependency to each one of your individual applications. It's worth mentioning that this is not a small change. This can be quite complex. And if you have a very large project, this could be a little bit painful. So it's worth thinking about this at the beginning, especially if you're working with a living style guide. You'll also need to think about how you handle changes to your living style guide over time and dealing with versioning that. You can use semantic versioning, for instance, to make that process a little bit easier to understand. And I definitely recommend maintaining really good documentation for your style guide projects specifically, because engineers who are working on other applications might not be intimately familiar with the details. It'd be really great for them to be able to come in and read some important details about the style guide and the individual components inside of it. So another technique that you could use to manage all of the code here is set up your project as a monorepo structure. And this means keeping packages that might be published separately or even different applications all in the same code base. Doing this has some benefits. It can make it way easier to look at a code base and understand what's going on. It can make it easier to get it up and running. Sometimes if you have many separate applications and many separate packages, that can get quite complex. But this also has some drawbacks. It can be a little bit complex to set up. I don't want to go into too much detail on this topic, but if you're interested, Lerna is a really popular tool that's used for managing monorepo projects. And it's actually even used by React and Angular themselves. Another really good example that I might point out is a popular component library called Blueprint, and they themselves use the monorepo structure to handle the complexity of their very large component library. And actually, there's a whole bunch of projects at Lab49 that are using Blueprint right now. If you dig into the code a little bit, you'll see that they have broken bits of their library out into separate packages that you can pull into your application. And you'll notice if you look through, all of the packages are in the same code base. They're all in one place. This could be a really good reference for how you might want to set up your project as a monorepo. So if you do this, breaking out your code into its own package, you can still do everything that you're already doing. So using things like code review and linting and formatting and testing, all of these things can be integrated with CI and CD, and they can be integrated with GitHub and Teams and Jira. And that process doesn't really change too much if you decide to use this technique to manage your component library. And also, just like any other package on NPM, if you write your component library with TypeScript, you can export all of your types, and the projects who use your component library can use those types too. So talking about tools beyond just the style guide itself, which I've been talking about Storybook, you're probably using tons of tools already on your projects now. You can do things like style checking with ESLint and StyleLint and Prettier. And all of those things should be integrated into the process of deploying your component library. Like I had mentioned, you can write your stories in TypeScript, and Storybook actually uses Webpack to run itself. And so you can integrate with Webpack too. You don't really have to make a whole lot of changes to your application in order to get something like this up and running. One other detail that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit more is deployment. And one of the really nice features of Storybook is that it can build a static version of itself. And so what you can do is generate simple static assets, just JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, and then you can deploy those so that other members of your team can actually look at them. Doing this on something like Netlify or Heroku is really, really easy. But again, because it's just a static website, you can deploy this pretty much anywhere. You can hook all of this stuff up to your normal build pipeline, and you can set it up to automatically deploy when you make changes, which is great because then your team has access to all of the latest updates as they're happening. So another set of tools that I wanted to talk about are the add-ons for Storybook. And before I get into this, I'm going to show a demo. I do want to mention, I know that I've been talking about really only Storybook up to now, but there are other tools that do this or something like this. So React Live is a little bit of an older project, There's React Cosmos and DocZ. They're all pretty much the same or have similar features, so I won't go into detail, but there are other options out there that are worth evaluating if you want to use a technique like this. Okay, so I want to flip over to a demo. And one of the things that I want to talk about here is one of the Storybook add-ons, and it's called Knobs. And what this allows you to do is control the inputs into your component. So on the screen now, we're looking at Chrome. You'll see that it's running on my local machine, and this is what Storybook looks like. On the left is a list of all of my stories, which mostly map one-to-one with components, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. I do want to point out that I want to focus on the base components here. So you can see that we have 3 stories for each one of our components: button, call out, and image. And in the middle is the actual component itself. So this isn't an image or a mock-up or anything like that. It's the real button that you can click and interact with. And so talking about the Knobs add-on, if you install that, you'll see there's this panel in the bottom where you get what are called knobs. And what's great about this is now you can control the inputs. So these generally map kind of one-to-one with, in this case, props. I wrote these components using React. This does support other UI libraries. You can do this with Vue or Angular as well. This happens to be React, and these map to my React props. So we can go ahead and edit this, and then we can see the actual component update live. You can do it kind of as you're typing. And this is great because you can come in here if you wanted to understand what a button looked like when it had a whole lot of text in it. You can actually do that here quite easily. You can also do other things, and there's different types of knobs, more than I'm just showing here, but you can quickly kind of interact with a button, change what it looks like, see all of its various states combined together. Here we have an intent prop, so primary and a danger. And so this is fantastic because you can quickly understand what this component is capable of and combine and mix and match all of these different props. I can show a few more examples here. So similarly, here's a call out component that also has some text inputs. So if you wanted to see what a really long title looked like, you can do that. If you wanted to see what it looked like without text, you can do that as well. And then this also takes an intent prop, so you get a few different visual treatments based on the intent that you set. Here's something slightly different, an image component. I set this here just to be an image from Unsplash, but maybe we want to change this to a portrait. And now we can get an understanding of what happens when we use this prop. So this is a great plugin. This is one of my favorites. I use this all the time. Okay, so code structure and style. So as I had mentioned very early on in the presentation, you're working on these UI components disconnected from your main application, and that can speed up development very significantly. And it happens in a couple of ways. First, you're working on just the UI component outside of the application. And this also allows you to parallelize work between your front-end engineering team and your back-end engineering team. And so, that does raise a question of how can you confidently develop your UI if maybe an API isn't ready yet? And there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can set up something like a mock API server. And you can, if you use a living style guide as your primary development environment, I believe that it helps encourage good structure so that you're structuring your application in layers. And this way your API interaction is separated from your UI layer, which means you can insulate your components from changes to the API. So here's obviously a very, very simplified example, but here's something that might be a user object that you might get from an API. And then we have a function here called prepare props. Maybe you could imagine using something like React Redux. And then that would change the object into something that a UI component would actually expect and understand. And this way you can kind of decouple your UI components from the API that's actually backing your application. So continuing down the path of encouraging good structure, I think that if you work in Storybook as your primary development environment, you can catch UI bugs. And there's lots of different kinds, but I'm going to flip back to the demo to step through a couple of examples, simplified of course, but help kind of illustrate the point. So over here on the left, back to my list of stories, I have this section that called compose components. And the idea here is that they take other base components and compose them together into something more complex. So these are stories just like the base components. They also have props that you can control. So for this example, this photo card component takes a Boolean prop for showing a like button. And if we go ahead and try and interact with that like button, we can see that we get some pretty weird behavior here. And I can pull up the code and we can go take a look at what's going on here. If we look into our source in our components directory, we take a look at our photo card styles. We can see over here that our like button is positioned absolutely. When we click on it, if we look at our button component styles, we can see here that it gets positioned relative and the top gets set to 1 pixel, which on the base component gives you this nice little kind of indent effect. So if we turn this back on, so we can see this is pretty undesired behavior. What's really nice is that we're finding this undesired behavior in Storybook. We haven't even integrated this into the application that we're actually working on. So if we wanted, we could then put in a fix, and we can see right away this hot reloads, and we're getting the correct behavior for this. We can go ahead and show another example of a UI bug that you might catch. If we look here, we have an intro card component. It has a photo component in the background and a button component in the middle. But if we come over here to Sketch, we have a design spec for our component. And if we look a little bit closer, we can see that this button is intended to be 200 pixels wide. And we can see here that that's not the case. So one thing that you might do is go over to the button component and make it 200 pixels. All right, great. So now this actually matches our design spec. But if we take a look at our button component, we see that we've made it so that the button text is overflowing the actual button itself. And of course, the issue here is that we made this change in the button component itself, which means that it affects every single button across the app. And so again, this is great because we're seeing the issue here in Storybook before we've deployed anything to our actual application. So if we go back and take a look at our styles, we can go ahead and see that we do want the button to be 200 pixels wide, but we don't want every button to be 200 pixels wide, just the one that's actually in our component. Okay, so flipping back. Okay, so you can take this a little bit further. And now we can start talking about a style guide. So I've been saying component a lot. And in this case, in the example that I just showed, those are React components, but it could be React or Vue or Angular. But there's other things that you can extract from your application that are not components themselves or don't map directly to an individual component like a React component. A really good example for this is typography. You could create a component for every single type style in your app, but in real apps, usually there's a mix of different styles of techniques for applying a typographic style. And no matter what the technique that you're using, those individual styles can be isolated from each other. And then what you can do is you can add that as a story. So now you have a centralized style guide that your team can see all in one place. I would also say that we could go even a step further than that and come up with a naming system for all of your styles, more even than just typography. So one thing that I really like to do is give each typographic style its own unique name. And I like to make sure also that the name that I give it is semantically disconnected from what it actually looks like. And some of the reasons that you would want to do something like this is that you don't always know in advance how a type style will be used. A type style that's very large and very prominent, it could be on an H1 element, but you could also appropriately apply that style to a P tag. You don't want to lock the names of your styles to the elements that they're applied to, because that can get quite confusing. Also, type styles and other styles in your application change over time. The biggest and the most prominent type style that you have now, that might not be true down the line. So how can you handle something like this? So you could name your styles like here, type style medium, and you can go larger and larger XXL and on, and it becomes a real problem. So I think that if you have a naming system like I described, it can make it much, much easier to communicate about your design system. So one example that I would give would be using city names as your potential system. It's just going to be easier to remember the differences between something like type style New York and type style San Francisco. The names that you give it make the concepts more memorable, and it also makes it easier to talk about instead of type style 1, type style 2, type style 3, etc. A third reason for doing something like this is to prevent that very common explosion of similar type styles across your system. Going back to speaking about design, it's generally good practice to use a limited number of type styles in any piece of design work, which will help reduce visual noise and confusion. So as an example, if we take a look at the New York subway system, or packaging for popular beer brands, something like Fat Tire, or the interface of popular consumer-facing apps like Airbnb. Well, all of these typographic choices are really well thought out. They're limited and they're carefully and deliberately chosen. Whatever naming system that you use, again, it's going to be much easier to talk about. You don't have to necessarily care anymore that type style New York is 12-point open sans, weight 600, italic, text transform uppercase with 2 pixels of letter spacing. You only need to remember the name, New York. If you have a naming system in place, it'll be a lot easier to spot typographic styles that are very similar to other existing styles, and you can control the number of styles in your application. It's also quite a lot easier to do this in your code too. You can use a tool like Sass, which I love very much. It'll allow you to abstract away the details of the individual typographic style and put it behind a name. And one way to do this, you could make mix-ins, which makes it easy to share those type styles across tons of different elements in your app. So here's an extremely simplified application. We see some type styles across 3 different selectors. All of it's duplicated. It's not dry. Instead, you can put it into a Sass mix-in, and the name fits within our design system. And on the right, you can see us using that mix-in. Clearly, this is much cleaner and more reusable and more maintainable. You're probably doing something like this already in your applications. So another explosion of similar styles. I know that every engineer has seen this a whole bunch. Let's say that you're working on an app and there's a primary brand color, and inevitably in the code, you have 1,000 different colors that are all pretty close to that brand color. So this is really, really common. And so here's an idea for doing something like this. Here you can see in this example, we're using planets as your naming system. We have a simple map. It has all of your colors in it. And on the right, using that map to pick out the colors that are a part of your style guide and using them in your code. So what else can we do besides just those 2 examples? So let's flip back to the demo. And you'll notice there's this grouping of stories at the top under the heading Style Guide. And so here's an example of typographic styles. And here you can see all of the typographic styles that are available in our application. I've also added names, and here's the mix-in that you might use in your Sass code. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. Similarly, here are some colors. Here I have the names, I have the actual hex code, which might be quite useful to know, even though you might not use this value in your code anymore. And then also here's a little Sass snippet if you wanted to use the colors map in your code. You can do other stuff too. It doesn't have to be just colors and typography. You can do this for box shadows. So here you can visually see all of the different box shadow values. And then the same thing, I'm using a naming system. In this case, I used artists. And then also I have a little snippet of Sass code if you actually wanted to use this box shadow in your application. So one of the further things that I did want to talk about is you'll notice that these stories map really to concepts and not individual components. And one of the really nice things about Storybook and other tools like it is that you write these in code. So in this case, I'm going to go over to my typography story. You'll see here that it is outside of the source directory because these stories don't map to individual components that we might use in our application. In this case, this Storybook story is itself just a React component, which means that you can do here anything that you do in React. If we take a look at our button story, you'll see that here we're importing our button component. And this is the real button component. Here it is over here, just a very simple React component that renders a button. But in the story, we import the real component. We set some configuration for Storybook. We set some more configuration for stuff like knobs that I had showed, and then it's just React. Similarly, over here in the typography story, it's just React. So we can add in all of this extra detail to our style guide stories, which provide a lot of extra clarity to the people who are coming in here and looking at this. You can add in extra details here, like here's your Sass snippet of code, which makes it easier for an engineer to understand how they might use this. You can put quite a lot of content into here, all kinds of documentation or extra details or extra visualizations to make it clearer to the users of your component library what's going on and how to use it. So what are we trying to do here by creating a design system? And some of what you're going to get is consistency, a shared language, and also you're going to build empathy with the rest of your team. So to summarize everything that we've gone over so far, why would you actually do something like this? You can make your development process easier. You can create that component library that you're going to use in your application, and you're also going to make your collaboration much better. In making your development easier, you get to have an isolated development environment for your UI. You can parallelize the work that you're doing on your team, and ultimately you can structure your application so that your data and your UI are separate layers. And you can also catch potential UI bugs faster if you're working in Storybook. You can create your component library. This means that you can structure your code as a component library, which in my opinion encourages good design decisions. You have a library that's going to make your code easier to explore and easier to share. And if you use a living style guide application, that's going to enable closer collaboration among the members of your team. And speaking of collaboration, you get to create that tighter feedback loop. People get to see what it is that you're working on sooner in the process before you have to go through a whole deployment process. You can share your work with non-technical members of your team. You can do that by deploying a living style guide application like Storybook somewhere where the rest of the team can access it. And you can share everything that you've accomplished across the whole team, and you can reduce potential wasted efforts, things like duplication across your UI code. All right, so thank you very much. That is my talk. So I think as part of this, I did want to leave some room for questions. So I'm more than happy to hang out for a while, answer questions, have a conversation. If anybody wants to go ahead and ask, let's do it.
I think Jason's been asking some questions on the chat.
Oh, yeah, okay, I see. Okay, so I see Jason is saying that he loves the SAS documentation. I assume that you're referring to the actual content of the story itself. Yeah, that's a really handy feature. Again, those stories, they're just React components. So if you wanted to, you could add in copy to clipboard functionality if you had bits of a code snippet, so that an engineer could just quickly make sure that they grab the right bit of code that they have to use. Let's see, Jason also asked, starting a new project, how much time should you allocate to setting this up for the team? If it's a brand new greenfield project, if you're starting from scratch, not that much. It's actually very, very easy to get this started, especially if you're familiar with React and the React ecosystem, which I'm going to say is including Webpack, because the Storybook application itself is based on Webpack. You might have to do some customizations in the Storybook Webpack configuration based on what you're trying to accomplish in your real app. So things like supporting SAS, or if you want to pass some options to some loaders that you're using, or if you want to use specific plugins, you might have to tweak that. And that requires a bit of familiarity with Webpack. But overall, just to get it started, it's very, very easy. If you have an existing project, the answer honestly is kind of the same. It's a really polished product. It's not going to take a whole lot of time to get this up and running. What might take more time is setting up that deployment process that I had talked about. So figuring out a way for you to build the static version of Storybook and deploy those static assets somewhere that other team members can see them. That might take some time. There could potentially, depending on what environment you're in, be security issues. You might want to integrate that with other parts of your build pipeline, whatever else that it is you're doing. That could potentially be a little bit complex, and it's good to be kind of aware of that up front. It's not something that you strictly need to do, but I would argue that it is very, very worth doing because of all of those collaboration benefits that I had outlined. And then Jason asked another question: how do we ensure Storybook stays up to date? So that's actually a really good question. And Storybook specifically actually has, I don't know if anybody noticed, but there was that Storybook logo up in the top left. It'll actually blink a little green thing at you if there's a new Storybook version. So you can always kind of stay up to date with what Storybook is doing. It's pretty active too. I don't know what their release schedule is exactly, but I would say that they do release pretty frequently. And the major version of Storybook that you saw in that demo, I guess is about a year old, maybe a little less. But they're constantly working on stuff, constantly making improvements. You can go to their GitHub. Again, it's all open source and kind of follow along with the development. But very easy to stay up to date. And whatever else you're doing with your other, is distributed on NPM, by the way, whatever you're doing with your other NPM packages will hold true for this. So I see Kelvin Kim says it was very useful. Thank you. Thank you, Kelvin. Okay, Yvonne is asking, how do you think navigation patterns or interactions fit into Storybook? So for that, you can actually put all of that stuff in the Storybook. I will admit that building really, really large, really, really complex components might require some forethought, especially if you have components that are nested in components, and they use maybe something like React Redux, for instance, it depends on your state. You might have to mock that out. Or if you're doing something like routing or API interaction or whatever, you might have to mock those things out, and you might have to think about how to structure your code in order to make that possible. But you can still put all of that stuff in Storybook. You can actually build up very, very complex interface flows, and you can do it right there in Storybook. And again, in the same way that there was that little bit of extra documentation in the style guide for something like navigation patterns or interactions, you can document that stuff right there in place. And then Yvonne, the second part of that question says, as well as a when to use guidelines to educate broader teams further. Yeah, this is great. This is something that a lot of popular component libraries do. I would definitely recommend checking out Blueprint and their documentation. They actually have kind of a similar structure as Storybook, although they don't use Storybook directly or at all. But they have a whole section at the top of their documentation that talks about when to use parts of their design system that they expose to you. So like there's a very, very good section about colors and all of the available colors, and not only how to use them in your code, but also they talk about color schemes and how the sets of colors are composed with each other. It's pretty interesting stuff. Definitely recommend taking a look at that.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah.
It's Jason. I wanted to follow up on the Storybook with Redux thing that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I want to just be careful about what we're actually testing in Storybook. So what we've been doing is never putting anything that has anything to do with state in Storybook, and which has been really helpful because it helps us figure out where the line is between a presentation component and a stateful component. So it's in this case, we are able to say, given these props, the component behaves this way. And I don't know how the component got the props. Redux provided it. It doesn't really matter. The point is that if this component receives these props, it looks and behaves like this. And then what we've been doing is using the actions add-on to test to see if clicking on this button dispatches the action I expect. And then we sort of infer that everything works, because if the component works in isolation, then it should work when it's connected to real data.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that goes back to kind of that planning that I was touching on a little bit, structuring your components so that you could easily place very large, complex components into something like Storybook while being disconnected from something like a Redux store, for instance, that might be backing some of the data that flows in as props. You might have other things. So sometimes that can be quite complex, and sometimes there might not be a good way around mocking out parts of what's going on in your UI, like Redux, like something like React Router, or other things that you might be using that have side effects. But again, a little bit of planning, a little bit of forethought can help kind of ease some of that type of development. I see Jim in the questions asked if this is going to be disseminated. Yeah, definitely. I think that all of the tech talks have been recorded, is my understanding, and they're available somewhere. I need to find out details about that, but this is recorded, and also the code that powers the Storybook demo that I showed, that is kind of like a little companion repository with this. I want to publish that as well. So it has a fully working Storybook demonstration. It has 2 different techniques for where to put your stories. It has other stuff like TypeScript and linting, and it also is fully documented. So it's really, really clean, and it should give you a pretty good example of how to structure things. In this particular example, it uses Sass to do styling, so that's kind of like built in. It's my preferred technique, but hopefully I can get that, the recording, the presentation, and I actually have, I'm writing a blog post that is all of the content for this presentation that hopefully will get published at some point in the very near future.
Yeah, I had a quick question. Are there any plugins available, or maybe it's available out of the box? So I know you showed the, what was it? The cogs or something similar to that?
Yeah.
Nogs. All right. Where you can actually just interact with directly with the properties themselves or whatever.
Yeah.
Is there more like a free-form playground, like, you know, for more complex components, if I want to say, hey, if I'm going to include this component in my component, you're going to have to write some JavaScript around it to see how the states are going to interact and things like that. So are there any plugins for that, or you would have to like go and write a custom story just to be able to see how?
So nothing comes to mind that's exactly like that, but there are plugins out there that will automatically build documentation for your components. And I don't know how it works exactly. It might like parse the contents of the file and like dig out code comments. There's a lot of them, and I'm sure they all work different ways, but those types of plugins do exist where they inspect what props a given component expects, and then it generates some documentation for you. So I'm not aware of a plugin that does what you describe. If there's not one out there, doing something like that would certainly be possible. There's really good documentation on Storybook about how to create plugins, add-ons for Storybook. And back when Storybook first came out, I wrote a couple myself too, just simple stuff. So it's definitely possible to do what you're describing. It might take a little bit of looking around to see if there's something that does it already. So Jason asked another question. He mentions that he's using Loki and Storybook to get visual snapshots. I'm actually not familiar with Loki. I've never used that before. It sounds like a really cool idea. Somebody's making dinner in the background. It sounds like a really cool idea. Again, I'm not aware of Loki specifically, but I do know that the current maintainers of Storybook actually have their own startup. I think it's called Chroma, maybe, where they do automated visual regression testing. So I've never used it personally. I think what you do is create a Storybook, and then you hook up Storybook to their SaaS product, and then it will run regression testing, and it'll spit out reports. I think the reports are visual. I'm not really sure, but definitely worth checking out that tool. It sounds pretty interesting, and I'll have to take a look at Loki because I did not know about it. Let's see, Danny mentioned something called $X for Java, which I'm also not familiar with, so I'll have to take a look at that too.
Yes, you have to.
Okay. Okay.
It's a testing tool that Danny has. It's a library that Danny has, perhaps over Selenium.
Okay. Yeah, looking at it now. Danny, did you create this tool?
Yes.
Little self-promotion.
I wanted to, if someone wants to use it, by all means. If they don't want, that's okay too. Question, are there any plugins to combine stories together, like to create complex stories? or it's an anti-pattern, or is it an anti-pattern? So let's say you want to, to create, a complex component.
So I don't know of any plugins that do that specifically. In cases where I've had to do something like really complex, like a whole page of an application, that itself is the component. And really the story is just about displaying that one component. So I don't know of anything that would combine stories together. But like I had said, there's a pretty good plugin architecture for this. So maybe somebody could write a plugin to do that. Yvonne says, thanks. Thank you, Yvonne. All right, great. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If anybody else wants to ask something, I'm happy to hang around for a couple more minutes. Also, if anybody else has questions, you can just reach out to me directly on Teams. I'm more than happy to jump on a call and talk about this stuff. I'm happy to show some code. We could dive in to the demo application that I put together if you want to try something like this out and you're not familiar. Yeah, feel free to reach out directly. All right. So
thank you. That was great.